Hello everyone and welcome to what is now part 3 in the engine swap series of my Mk1 Golf. In today's episode we are going to be pulling out my current engine and switching it out with the 2-liter engine that was prepared in the previous video. Enjoy!
All my friends, hello rider.
My engine bay currently looks like this. I already drained out all the coolant and took out the radiator because I needed to make some measurements for the new cooling setup, but more on that later. Right now we are going to focus on disconnecting everything else around the engine, starting with the battery. Next we are going to concentrate on completely freeing up the gearbox. I'm starting on top by removing the shift linkage, the clutch and speedo cable and the switch for the reversing lights. Next up are the drive shafts. Apart from the engine mounts, everything from the gearbox is now disconnected, so I'm moving on to removing part of the exhaust. To do this I need to remove these exhaust clamps from hell. If you've worked on Mk1s before, you'll know that these are a pain in the neck to remove and even worse to install. The good news is that there will be no need to reinstall these clamps, but that will become clear later on in this build. Up next I'm disconnecting everything from the fuel system, which includes the fuel lines and the carburetor. Then I'm removing the remaining miscellaneous bits from the wiring harness and coolant hoses, which is the last step before we can start unbolting the engine mounts. In total there are 4 engine mounts holding up the engine and gearbox. One is located on the engine and the other 3 are on the gearbox. First I'm taking off the one that sits right under the firewall. With it removed, I dropped the car all the way down on the ground and supported the engine with a tire, so that there is no more tension on the other engine mounts. There is one right next to the timing belt cover, another one is in the middle next to the starter, and the last one is on the right side of the gearbox. The left mount on the engine is only attached by one bolt that slides out towards the back of the engine. The central mount shares its bolts with the starter, so that needs to be removed as well. The mount on the gearbox is attached with a single bolt to the chassis and 2 bolts to the gearbox. And voila, we have completely freed up the entire engine. Instead of pulling it out from the top like we did last time with the skid steer, I'm opting to lift the car off the engine, which is the opposite way of how these engines were installed at the factory. So the engine is out of the car, but that doesn't mean we can go straight into swapping this one in, because obviously we have some stuff to do first, and one of them is changing the engine mounts, because as you can see, the ones that were on my 1.8 are in pretty terrible condition. First, I'm using a metal saw to make 2 cuts into the old mounts. As you can see, I'm doing this on my now famous wobbly table, which does not make this an enjoyable viewing experience, but it's all I've got at the moment. But don't worry, in a couple of weeks I'm going to build a proper workbench in this corner of the shop. With the cuts made, I'm using a chisel to peel away a strip of metal so that the tension in the piece reduces. I tried installing the new mount with my vise, since I still don't own a press, but it didn't work. But later I went to Thibaut's workshop and together we managed to press in the new mount. After installing the mount on the block, I started experimenting with timing belt covers that I had laying around, and eventually I found a combination that kind of fits. It took some minor modifications and it doesn't look perfect, but for the time being it will do. Next I took the engine off the stand and laid it down onto a cart. I want to mount the gearbox before everything goes into the car, and on the engine stand this was not possible, hence why I'm using the cart. Before throwing on the clutch and gearbox though, we are going to put on a new crankshaft seal. Then I'm putting on the transmission cover. It is very easy to forget to install these when you're mounting a gearbox, don't ask me how I know. In most engine and gearbox configurations, now would be the time to mount the flywheel, but for some reason Volkswagen opted to have the clutch assembly sitting in reverse order. So first we have a pressure plate mounted up to the crankshaft, which has a thrust plate mounted on top of it with a spring. Before installing the clutch and flywheel, I always wipe down everything to remove any leftover oils or grease. It is important to note that 2-liter gearboxes have a larger input shaft than the ones you commonly find on Mark 1 and Mark 2 gearboxes. That is why I had to buy an earlier style clutch kit, since my gearbox is from a Mark 2 diesel. The diameter of the clutch, however, is exactly the same. I picked up this O2O gearbox from a junkyard. It has slightly longer gear ratios since it came off a diesel model, and it is in pretty good shape. Off camera I gave it a coat of paint and changed the output flange seals. Okay, so I think that the engine is ready to go into the engine bay. Before I'm going to do that, I will take off the inlet manifold with the carbs just for clearance issues. I think it will be way easier to move everything up into the engine bay with those removed. It is going to be quite challenging to do this all by myself. There's nobody around currently, but I think we will manage to do it. I'm going to lower the car very slowly onto the engine, while making sure that it is in the right position and obviously not hitting anything. And I also have to make sure that the engine is at the right angle, because currently it is sitting straight up, but in the engine bay it is slanted to the back slightly. So those are the challenges we have ahead of us for installing this engine. It took some wrestling, but after an hour I managed to connect the left and right engine mounts. Now let's throw in the front and rear mounts to prevent the engine from tilting. The front mount needs to be installed together with the starter, and for the occasion I bought a fresh new one. Okay, so now that the engine is fully connected to the body, we can start plumbing it in. And the first thing I want to do is make sure that the cooling circuit is connected. We have this new radiator that I picked up from the junkyard. I actually still need to clean it a little bit. And then I also got a variety of coolant hoses that I also picked up from the wrecking yard. And with all of these hoses we should be able to MacGyver something up in the engine bay. The coolant setup is one of the more trickier parts of this build. I can't mount a stock Mk1 radiator or my carbs are going to hit them. That is why I picked up this one from the junkyard, which is slightly thinner and can slide more forward. That does mean that I will have to come up with my own way to connect it to the rest of the coolant system and the car. Luckily I have a lot of coolant hoses at my disposal, so we can puzzle something together. I also got a new expansion tank to clean up the engine bay a bit. A lot of hose clamps and cursing later, I managed to put something together. It doesn't look the cleanest, but I reckon it's going to work just fine. Knowing how everything is going to route also gave me the opportunity to finally hard mount the radiator. Thibaut swung by and together we filled up the coolant system with tap water. That way my workshop won't become a sticky mess if something fails. Okay, so it seems that the coolant system is retaining the water pretty well. So for now I think the coolant system is handled. I'm still waiting on 2 Mishimoto fans to arrive, and then those are going to be mounted here. But other than that, the coolant system is done and we can move on to something else. And what I want to do now is take a final look at the carbs before we are going to do the first startup on the engine. I still need to adjust the floats in both of them, and then I also am going to take a look at the basic settings that I'm going to put these at for doing the first start. The floats are an essential part in the functioning of the carburetors. They open and close the needle that regulates the fuel level inside of the carburetors. Depending on their weight, they need to be set up differently. My floats weigh 8.5 grams, which means that I have to adjust them between 15.5 to 16 millimeters, measuring between the gasket and the float right before the needle starts to close up. With that done, I'm also installing the rubber spacers and washers that will protect my carburetors from vibrations. Next, I'm turning in the idle mixer screws all the way and then screw them out 3.5 turns, which should be a good starting point to fire up the engine. And with all of that done, the lovely package can be installed on the engine. In order for the carburetors to have a sufficient amount of fuel supply, I had to install an electric fuel pump next to the fuel tank. I selected this pump because it allows the system to run without a fuel pressure regulator or a return line. So it simply is a matter of attaching the fuel supply line to both of the carburetors and the fuel system is done. The exhaust system also gets some new hardware with this new 421 exhaust manifold from TA Technics. I don't know if it is any good, but at least I don't need to mess around with those darn exhaust clamps anymore. To make it fit, I need to cut off a section of my current exhaust and then it can be mounted with a new gasket. So, with the exhaust also done, only a few tasks remain. An oil catch can got mounted that was connected temporarily because it kind of looks hideous, but for now it will do just fine. And then lastly, the wiring harness and stuff like the spark plug cables got installed, making the engine ready for its first start. A lot has been accomplished in this episode, and the engine bay looks way better than in the beginning of this video. There still is a lot to do, but at least the engine is ready for its first crank, which will be the subject for the next video in this series. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if you did, consider subscribing and dropping a like, and keep an eye on the channel for more videos on this subject. Thank you for watching, and until next time.